The British sleeve gun that turned. The British sleeve gun that turned handshakes into assassinations. Paris, 14th February, 1944. A man in a grey overcoat walks briskly along the Rue de Rivoli, his breath misting in the cold morning air. To any German officer watching from a cafe window, he is unremarkable. A middle-aged Frenchman with the hunched posture of someone who has learned that invisibility is a form of survival. His papers are impeccable. His manner is calm. His hands, tucked into the pockets of his coat, are perfectly still. He spots his target on the pavement ahead. A Gestapo officer, decorated, confident, flanked loosely by the ordinary bustle of occupied Paris. The Frenchman does not slow his pace. He does not reach inside his jacket. He does not fumble for a weapon or dart into a doorway. He simply walks forward, and at the moment of passing, he extends his right hand, the gesture of a man greeting an acquaintance, and presses it firmly against the officer's side. There is no bang, no flash, just a muted, mechanical click, barely audible above the noise of the street. By the time the German officer begins to understand what has happened, the man in the grey coat has already turned the corner. By the time he collapses, the assassin is 3 streets away. What the Frenchman carried in his sleeve was not a pistol in any conventional sense. It had no trigger, no barrel in the traditional meaning of the word, no hammer, no grip. It was a device roughly the length of a fountain pen, casing and not much wider than a man's thumb. It fired a single point, 3.2 ACP round at a range measured in inches rather than meters. It was designed by officers working in conditions of extraordinary secrecy for Britain's Special Operations Executive. The organisation Winston Churchill had ordered, in the summer of 1940, to set Europe ablaze. It was called, in the dry language of SOE's Technical Directorate, the sleeve gun. In the field, among the men and women who carried it, it was sometimes called the stocking gun, or simply the silent death. It is one of the most audacious weapons ever produced by British ingenuity, a device so conceptually radical that it redefined what an assassination weapon could be. It did not merely allow an agent to kill at close range, it allowed an agent to kill during the act of greeting someone. It weaponized the handshake. And in doing so, it changed the calculus of clandestine warfare in occupied Europe in ways that have never been fully appreciated. To understand why the sleeve gun existed, you need to understand the particular and brutal problem facing Allied agents working in Nazi-occupied territory from 1941 onwards. The problem was not courage. The men and women recruited by SOE and trained at its country houses across England possessed that in extraordinary measure. The problem was not intelligence, nor was it motivation. The problem was the moment of contact, that fraction of a second in which an agent had to move from their cover identity to an act of violence, and do so without alerting anyone within a radius that could get them caught. Every conventional firearm available to SOE agents in the early years of the war required the same fundamental sequence of actions. The weapon had to be drawn. It had to be raised or at least extended. The trigger had to be pulled. Even the most compact pistols of the era, the Walter PPK at roughly 155mm in length, the Colt model 1903 pocket hammerless at 165mm, required a deliberate visible movement to bring to bear. In a crowded street, in a railway station, in a corridor, that movement cost time. More importantly, it cost secrecy. German security services had, by 1942, become extraordinarily sophisticated at identifying agents. The SD and Gestapo ran networks of informants that penetrated resistant cells with disturbing regularity. Checkpoints were common. Searches were unpredictable. An agent carrying a conventional sidearm risked discovery every time they passed through a doorway, guarded by a soldier with orders to pat down civilians. Weapons were therefore often left behind, buried in gardens, hidden in wall cavities, cached in countryside barns, and retrieved only when an operation was imminent. But the most dangerous operations were precisely the ones that could not be planned with perfect foresight. The spontaneous encounter, the unexpected opportunity, the moment when a target presented itself and the agent had, at most, a few seconds to act or let the chance pass entirely. The existing solutions were inadequate. The well rod, that beautifully engineered bolt-action suppressed pistol developed by the Inter-Services Research Bureau, was magnificent at what it did. A weapon roughly 300 millimeters in length that reduced the sound of a .32 ACP discharge to something comparable to a car door closing firmly. But it still needed to be drawn, aimed, and fired. The Liberator, that crude, pressed steel single-shot pistol produced in its millions by the United States, was cheap and distributable, but offered nothing in terms of concealment during actual close contact work. Neither weapon solved the fundamental problem, the visible draw. What SOE Station 9, its research and development facility housed at the Frythe, a Victorian country house near Welwyn, in Hertfordshire, needed to produce was something that eliminated the draw entirely. A weapon that could be carried on the body, concealed from the most thorough pat-down search, and deployed without any preparatory movement that a trained observer might detect. The requirements were almost impossibly demanding. The weapon had to be flat enough to sit against the forearm and be held in place by a sleeve. It had to fire reliably. It had to be simple enough for an agent under extreme stress to operate with one hand, and it had to kill. The team at Station 9, which operated under the cover name of the Welwyn Experimental Station and was staffed by engineers, gunsmiths, and chemists drawn from civilian life and bound by strict compartmentalization, produced a device of remarkable elegance. The sleeve gun, formerly designated by some internal SOE documents as the pistol, Sleeve .32, was built around a steel tube roughly 190 millimeters in length and approximately 22 millimeters in diameter. That is, to give a practical comparison, roughly the diameter of a standard UK 50p coin and about the length of a large marker pen. Inside this tube sat a single .32 ACP cartridge loaded from the front. The firing mechanism was not a conventional trigger arrangement at all. Instead, the device used a spring-loaded plunger system. The plunger was cocked by pressing the front of the tube against a surface. Any surface, including a human body, which compressed a heavy coil spring. When sufficient pressure was applied, the mechanism released automatically, driving a fixed firing pin into the primer of the cartridge. There was no separate trigger action required. The act of pressing the device against the target was itself the firing mechanism. The tube was attached to a simple webbing harness worn on the forearm beneath a jacket or coat sleeve. In its resting state, the front of the device sat perhaps 15 millimeters back from the end of the wearer's fingertips when the hand was open and extended. To fire it, the agent simply extended their hand in a natural gesture. A handshake, a shove, a push, and made firm contact with the target. The spring released, the round fired. The entire mechanical sequence, from first contact to discharge, took approximately a quarter of a second. The sound signature was minimal. The short barrel meant that propellant gases expanded before the projectile exited the tube, producing a report described in Station 9's own test documentation as considerably reduced compared to an unsuppressed pistol. Witnesses at Station 9 testing described the sound as a sharp crack rather than a bang, quieter than a car backfiring, louder than a firm handclap. At a range of 30 meters, in an urban environment with ambient noise, it would not necessarily draw immediate attention. At a range of 0 meters, the operating range for which it was designed, the sound was largely academic, because the only people close enough to hear it clearly were the agent, the target, and anyone within roughly 5 meters. The weapon weighed approximately 230. The weapon weighed approximately 230 grams fully loaded, lighter than a full tin of baked beans. It could be manufactured using lathe-turned steel and simple assembly techniques available in any reasonably equipped workshop. Station 9 produced them in batches, the exact figures remaining partially classified, though estimates from post-war assessments suggest several hundred units were completed over the course of the weapon's production run, from approximately late 1942 through to 1944. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Operational deployment of the sleeve gun was never widespread in the sense that a standard infantry weapon might be. Its role was narrow and specific: close contact assassination of high-value targets in environments where conventional weapon use was impossible. SOE field officers who received the device were given training in its use at the organization's finishing schools, most notably at Beaulieu in Hampshire, where agents undertook final preparation before deployment. The training emphasis was on naturalness of movement, how to extend the hand without telegraphing intent, how to position the body so that the recoil, which was modest but present, did not produce a visible flinch. Documented operational use is, as with so much of SOE's work, fragmentary. The organization maintained a deliberate policy of minimal paperwork for the most sensitive operations, and many field reports were destroyed either during the war to prevent capture or afterwards under routine declassification policies that erred, sometimes controversially, on the side of permanent secrecy. What the surviving record shows is that the sleeve gun was issued to agents operating primarily in France, the Low Countries, and Denmark, theatres where urban assassination work was most active and where the problem of concealment was most acute. French resistance networks aligned with SOE, the F-section circuits with names like Prosper, Stockbroker, and Headmaster, received small quantities of sleeve guns alongside their more conventional arms drops. Accounts from surviving agents and post-war debriefings held at the National Archives in Kew describe the psychological effect of carrying the device as significant. Agents reported that knowing they could act without any visible preparation changed their mental approach to dangerous encounters. The weapon did not merely provide a means of killing, it provided a form of confidence. The knowledge that even a checkpoint, even a forced handshake with a German officer conducting a document check, could become an opportunity rather than purely a threat. The Germans were aware that such devices existed. SD intelligence reports from 1943 and 1944 reference captured SOE materials and warn of concealed firing mechanisms attached to the body. Whether this awareness translated into effective countermeasures is doubtful. The very nature of the device made it extraordinarily difficult to detect. A thorough physical search might find the harness, but an agent who had been trained to remove and discard the harness quickly could do so in a lavatory or a doorway with only seconds to spare. The .32 ACP cartridge, once loaded, was inside the tube and not visible on cursory inspection. German security personnel checking for weapons were looking, primarily, for pistols, knives, and grenades, the conventional vocabulary of violence. Comparing the sleeve gun to its contemporaries reveals just how genuinely radical the British approach was. Germany produced no direct equivalent. The Sicherheitsdienst and Abwehr were considerable innovators in many areas of clandestine technology, but their assassination devices tended toward the conventional. Compact pistols, suppressed Walters, specialized ammunition. The concept of eliminating the draw entirely does not appear in captured German technical documentation from the period. American OSS engineers, working in parallel with SOE, developed their own range of concealed weapons, including the famous Stinger, a single-shot .22 device roughly the size of a cigar. The Stinger was effective in its own right, but it still required the user to hold it in the palm of the hand. A detectable posture to any trained observer, looking for the slight closing of the fingers. The sleeve gun kept the hand open. The closest German attempt at the same problem space was arguably the Kampfpistole, a modified signal pistol capable of firing anti-personnel rounds. But this was a weapon of completely different operational logic, designed for squad-level combat rather than individual close-contact assassination. Germany simply did not produce anything that combined the concealment profile, the mechanism of activation, and the deployment philosophy of the SOE device. In this particular technical race, Britain won comprehensively and, perhaps more remarkably, produced a winner that Germany apparently never even understood existed until it was too late for the information to be operationally useful. The legacy of the sleeve gun sits in an unusual position within the broader history of special operations weaponry. Materially, its impact was limited by its numbers. Several hundred weapons across multiple theatres of operation, issued to agents working in cells, numbering at most a few dozen people each, could not alter the operational balance of an entire occupied continent. The German garrison of France alone numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The Gestapo and SD, for all their vulnerability to individual assassination attempts, replaced personnel with the grim efficiency of an institution that had convinced itself it was winning. Removing one officer, however senior, rarely paralyzed the machine for more than days. But the psychological and doctrinal legacy is considerably more durable. The sleeve gun represented the first fully realized implementation of what we might now call zero-signature weapons design. The philosophy that the ideal assassination weapon is one whose use cannot be distinguished from ordinary human behavior until after the fact. Every subsequent generation of special operations planners, from the Cold War period through to the present, has grappled with the same design problem the Station 9 team solved in their Hertfordshire workshops in 1942. How do you put lethal capability into the hands of an agent in a way that is invisible to even a trained observer at close range? The SOE's answer: use the body's own natural gestures as the delivery mechanism, eliminate the draw entirely, and build the firing mechanism into the act of contact itself, was not improved upon for decades. Variants of the concealed contact weapon concept appeared in American special operations programs during the Cold War, in the armory of various intelligence services operating in proxy conflicts from Southeast Asia to Latin America, and in the design specifications of counter-terrorism units that came into existence in the 1970s. None of them cited the sleeve gun by name, because its existence was not widely known, but the logic was identical. A small number of surviving sleeve guns exist in museum collections. The Imperial War Museum in London holds examples, as does the Lyon collection in Switzerland, which houses one of the more comprehensive private collections of SOE materiel assembled by any private institution. Handling records from conservation departments describe the devices as surprisingly light, almost toy-like in their dimensions, belying entirely the purpose for which they were built. There is something characteristic about SOE weaponry in general: the well rod, the sleeve gun, the well bike motorcycle, a tendency toward the miniature and the mundane, as though the engineers at Station 9 took a certain satisfaction in making dangerous things look like nothing at all. Return, then, to that February morning in Paris. The man in the grey overcoat turning the corner. the German officer beginning to understand that something is wrong, that the handshake felt strange, that there was a sound he cannot quite place. The sleeve gun already separated from its harness, tucked into a trouser pocket, or dropped into a gutter. The agent 3 streets away, then 5, then a kilometre, then gone. What had just happened was the product of a very particular British wartime genius. Not the genius of industrial scale, which belonged to America, nor the genius of systematic technical development, which in many ways belonged to Germany, but the genius of improvisation under pressure, of engineers in a converted country house near Welwyn, working with lathes and springs and slide rules, solving a problem that had never been formally articulated before. How do you kill a man in a crowded street without anyone seeing you reach for a weapon? The answer was that you did not reach for a weapon. You were already holding it. You had been holding it since you left your safe house that morning. Through 3 document checks and a tram ride and a walk along a boulevard lined with soldiers. You had been holding it through everything, and no one had seen it, because there was nothing to see. That is what Station 9 built in the autumn of 1942. Not merely a weapon, a new geometry of violence. One in which the most dangerous moment looked, to every observer on that Paris street, exactly like a greeting. The sleeve gun did not win the war, but it demonstrated, in the most visceral terms possible, that in clandestine warfare, the side that controls what the enemy can see controls everything else that follows.